when the worst natural disaster in a century wiped out a multi-million-dollar agricultural valley. It left exactly one farm completely untouched. This is the true-to-life story of a stubborn farmer who bet his entire livelihood on a forbidden seed, defying every expert and surviving the apocalypse. The ledger on Arthur Huntington's massive oak desk told a story that was becoming all too common in the lower basin of the Cumberland Valley. It was a story written in red ink, culminating in a terrifying, undeniable figure: $842,500. That was the debt his family farm carried into the early spring of 2018. Arthur was a fourth-generation farmer, a man whose hands looked like tanned leather and whose back bore the permanent ache of decades spent wrestling with the earth. For a century, the Huntington farm had been the pride of the valley, boasting 400 acres of prime, loamy soil. But the last 3 years had been brutal. 2 years of aggressive drought followed by a season of devastating blight had crippled his yields. The entire valley was hurting. But the pain wasn't shared equally. Gregory Carmichael saw to that. Carmichael was the head of the Cumberland Valley Agricultural Board and the owner of Carmichael AgriCorp, a sprawling corporate farming operation that had been slowly swallowing up independent farms for a decade. Carmichael was a businessman first and a farmer second. He drove a pristine luxury truck that had never seen a muddy rut, and his solution to the valley's woes was a newly patented, genetically modified corn seed called Aegis 7. Aegis 7 was engineered to grow fast, yield massive uniform ears of corn, and survive on a trickle of water. But it came with a catch. The seeds were sterile, meaning farmers had to buy them fresh from Carmichael every single year, along with the proprietary chemical fertilizers required to keep them alive. Worse, the root systems of the Aegis 7 were incredibly shallow. They barely gripped the topsoil, sacrificing structural integrity for rapid above-ground growth. Arthur's son, David, a pragmatic 24-year-old with a degree in agribusiness, was terrified. "Dad, you have to sign the contract with Carmichael," David pleaded one evening, pacing the worn floorboards of their farmhouse kitchen. "Sarah Jenkins at the bank called me today. She didn't want to call you because she knows your temper. If we don't show the bank a guaranteed yield projection using the Aegis 7 seeds, they are going to foreclose by October. We'll lose the house. We'll lose the land." Arthur stared into his black coffee. "Greg Carmichael wants us on a leash, Davy. You plant that shallow root garbage, you strip the soil of its soul. You're just renting the dirt at that point. It's not farming, it's an assembly line." "It's survival," David shouted, his voice cracking with the heavy burden of their reality. "I love this land too, Dad. But pride isn't going to pay the first agricultural union. I'm begging you." But Arthur had a different plan, one born of desperation and a late-night encounter that would change the trajectory of their lives. A month prior, Arthur had attended a quiet estate sale of an old, eccentric university agronomist named Dr. Harrison Cole. While browsing the dusty barn, Arthur found a heavily padlocked chest. Inside were leather-bound journals and several vacuum-sealed bags of a strange, dark seed. According to Dr. Cole's meticulous notes, the seed was an experimental hybrid of an ancient perennial grain and a hardy wetland sedge. He called it deep-root sedge wheat. Dr. Cole's notes detailed a plant that didn't waste its energy shooting up rapidly. Instead, it spent its first 2 months driving thick, fibrous roots up to 12 feet deep into the earth. It was a perennial, meaning it would come back year after year without replanting, and its deep roots could tap into underground aquifers during droughts or anchor the soil like reinforced concrete during floods. There was only one problem. 3 years ago, the Cumberland Valley Agricultural Board, spearheaded by Gregory Carmichael, had explicitly banned the cultivation of perennial sedge hybrids in the valley. Carmichael claimed it was an invasive risk that could cross-pollinate and ruin the purity of his highly controlled, patented corn yields. Anyone caught planting it faced astronomical fines and being blacklisted from the regional processing silos. Arthur knew planting it was a declaration of war, but as he looked at his grandfather's portrait hanging above the mantel, He realized he would rather go down fighting on his own terms than die a slow, subservient death working for Carmichael. The next week, at the mandatory spring Grange Hall meeting, Carmichael stood at the podium, flanked by glossy charts showing the projected profits of his Aegis 7 corn. The room was packed with exhausted, desperate farmers, ready to sign away their independence just to survive another year. "The future is standardization, gentlemen," Carmichael proclaimed, his voice booming over the PA system. "We control the variables. We control the profits." Arthur stood up. The folding chair scraped loudly against the linoleum floor, silencing the room. "The only thing you're controlling, Greg, is the noose around our necks," Arthur said, his voice steady but carrying a dangerous edge. "That corn of yours is an addict. It needs your chemicals to live, and a stiff wind could knock it over because it's got no foundation." Carmichael's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Arthur, I heard Sarah Jenkins is knocking on your door. You should be the first one in line to sign this contract. Don't let your stubbornness ruin your son's future." "My son's future is in the soil, not in your corporate ledger," Arthur shot back. "I'm passing on the Aegis 7. I'm planting my own crop this year." Whispers erupted across the hall. Carmichael leaned into the microphone. "Just make sure whatever you plant complies with board regulations, Arthur. We'd hate to have to levy a fine on a man who is already bankrupt." Arthur didn't reply. He turned and walked out of the hall. He had made his bed. Now he had to plant it. The planting season began in the bitter chill of early April. While the rest of the Cumberland Valley was meticulously laying down uniform rows of Carmichael's chemically treated corn, Arthur was out in his fields with an old seed drill, laying down the deep-root sedge wheat. The tension in the Huntington house had become unbearable when David saw the dark, unorthodox seeds filling the hopper of the tractor. He finally broke. "You're crazy," David said, throwing his work gloves into the dirt. "You are actually trying to bankrupt us. Carmichael's inspectors will be out here by June, Dad. They'll fine us $10,000 an acre for planting a banned perennial. By June, the roots will be too deep for them to pull," Arthur replied, not taking his eyes off the tractor's gauges. "I can't watch you destroy our family," David said, his voice trembling. "I told Carmichael I'd manage his northern sector. He offered me a salary. I took it." Arthur's hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, but he didn't look at his son. "If you walk off this land now, David, don't expect it to be here for you when you come back." David turned on his heel and walked toward his pickup truck. As the taillights faded down the gravel driveway, Arthur felt a hollow ache in his chest that hurt worse than his failing back. He was utterly alone. By mid-May, the valley was a sea of vibrant emerald green. Carmichael's Aegis 7 was performing exactly as advertised, shooting up out of the ground at a miraculous pace. The local news stations were already doing feature segments on the Cumberland agricultural miracle. Arthur's farm, however, looked like a barren wasteland. The sedge wheat was growing, but barely above the surface. It looked like scrubby, uneven patches of dark grass. To the untrained eye, it looked like a failed crop overrun by weeds. His neighbors drove past his acreage, shaking their heads. Arthur endured the snickers at the local diner, the pitying looks from the hardware store clerk, and the cold, formal letters from Sarah Jenkins at the bank, warning him that his farm was slated for auction on November 1st. What the valley couldn't see was what was happening below the surface. Below the topsoil, the sedge wheat was violently driving its roots downward, fracturing hard-pan clay, seeking deep moisture, and weaving an intricate, unbreakable subterranean net holding the 400 acres together. Then, the meteorological anomaly of the century began. It started on May 24th. The forecasters called it a stalled atmospheric river. Usually, spring storms in the valley blew through in a matter of hours. This one didn't move. A massive, swirling system of dense moisture locked itself directly over the Cumberland Basin. For the first 3 days, it was just heavy rain. Farmers grumbled about the mud, but nobody panicked. But by day 5, the rain hadn't stopped. It poured in sheets, a relentless, deafening drumbeat on tin roofs. The soil, long stripped of its natural organic matter by years of chemical farming, could not absorb the deluge. By day 8, the local emergency sirens began to wail. Arthur sat on his porch, a mug of cold coffee in his hands, watching the water pool in his lower fields. The radio crackled with frantic reports. The Cumberland River had breached its banks in 3 places. The Mercer Dam, 30 miles upstream, was at 104% capacity and threatening a catastrophic structural failure. At 2 a.m. on the 9th day, the nightmare became reality. The emergency broadcast system screeched through the house. The Mercer Dam had released a massive emergency spill to prevent collapse, sending a 4-foot wall of muddy, violently churning water barreling down the valley floor. Arthur grabbed his flashlight and his golden retriever, Buster, and retreated to the 2nd floor of the farmhouse. He looked out the window into the pitch-black night. The sound was something he would never forget, a low, roaring rumble like a fleet of freight trains tearing through the darkness, underscored by the snapping of old oak trees. When the floodwaters hit the valley's vast expanses of shallow-rooted corn, it wasn't just a matter of the crops drowning. Because the Aegis 7 roots barely penetrated the surface, they offered zero resistance to the rushing current. The water acted like a massive scalpel, effortlessly peeling the topsoil right off the bedrock. Millions of dollars of crops, fertilizers, and topsoil were liquefied into a toxic, brown slurry and washed away in minutes. Arthur watched in horror as the water reached his property line. The flood hit his fields with the same brutal force. The water rose up to his front porch, swirling violently, carrying debris, fence posts, tires, and uprooted corn stalks from Carmichael's northern sector. For 2 agonizing days, Arthur was trapped on the 2nd floor, listening to the rushing water, praying that the old farmhouse foundation would hold. He thought about David. He thought about the legacy of the Huntington farm, ending in a muddy, underwater grave. He assumed he had lost everything. The bank wouldn't even need to foreclose. There would be nothing left to take. On the morning of the 3rd day, the rain finally stopped. The sun broke through the heavy, bruised clouds, casting a harsh, glaring light over the valley. The floodwaters had begun to recede, leaving behind a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet. Arthur pushed open his front door, his boots sinking into 3 inches of thick, foul-smelling silt on his porch. He walked out to the edge of his yard and looked out over the Cumberland Valley. Total, apocalyptic devastation. As far as the eye could see, Carmichael's empire was gone. Not just the crops, the earth itself was gone. The fields were stripped down to the pale, rocky subsoil. Deep, jagged ravines had been carved through the land by the violent currents. The highly engineered, miracle corn had been entirely erased from existence. Arthur braced himself and slowly turned his gaze toward his own 400 acres. He wiped his eyes, unsure if the glaring sun was playing tricks on him. He blinked. He walked a few steps closer. His land was still there. Not only was the topsoil completely intact, perfectly anchored by the invisible 12-foot deep subterranean net of roots, but the sedge wheat had survived. The thick, wiry stalks had simply bent under the rushing water, and now, with the water receding, they were springing back up, resilient and fiercely green against the brown destruction of the valley. It was an island of life in a sea of ruin. Arthur fell to his knees in the mud, his chest heaving as tears streamed down his weathered face. He hadn't just saved his farm, he had saved the earth itself. For 3 days following the flood, the Cumberland Valley was a ghost town, accessible only by FEMA helicopters and flat-bottom rescue boats. The smell of stagnant water and rotting vegetation hung thick in the humid air. Arthur Huntington spent those days walking the perimeter of his property, marveling at the impossible. His 400 acres of deep-root sedge wheat had not just survived, they were thriving. The nitrogen-rich floodwaters, which had poisoned and drowned the rest of the valley, acted as a massive dose of natural fertilizer for the deep-reaching perennial. On the 4th morning, the growl of a diesel engine broke the eerie silence. A heavy-duty, mud-splattered pickup truck fishtailed up Arthur's driveway, the wheels spinning fiercely for traction in the thick silt that coated the county road. Arthur stood on his porch, a shotgun resting casually against his leg, though he didn't reach for it. The truck door swung open, and David stepped out. His son looked utterly broken. David was covered head to toe in a foul mixture of mud and chemical sludge. His eyes were bloodshot, staring blankly at the vibrant green stalks of Arthur's fields. He walked slowly toward his father, ignoring the squelch of his boots. "The northern sector is gone, Dad," David whispered, his voice hoarse from yelling over the roar of the floodwaters days prior. Carmichael's entire operation. The silos collapsed. The tractors are buried in the ravines. There's not an inch of topsoil left. It's just bedrock. We lost everything. Arthur stepped off the porch and pulled his son into a tight embrace, uncaring about the mud. "You didn't lose everything, Davy. You're breathing and you're home." David pulled back, his eyes finally focusing on the rolling green acreage behind his father. Tears welled up, cutting clean tracks through the dirt on his cheeks. "You were right. God, you were right. How is it still here?" "It held the earth," Arthur said softly, just like Dr. Cole said it would. The reunion was short-lived. Later that afternoon, a procession of 3 vehicles forced their way up the damaged road. Leading the pack was a black SUV bearing the seal of the Cumberland Valley Agricultural Board. Following closely was a county sheriff's cruiser and a flatbed carrying a small bulldozer. Gregory Carmichael stepped out of the SUV. He looked nothing like the polished corporate executive from the Grange Hall meeting. His face was pale, his expensive suit was crumpled, and a frantic, dangerous energy radiated from him. His multi-million-dollar empire had evaporated overnight, leaving him horribly exposed to his creditors. Sheriff Miller, a man who had known Arthur since high school, stepped out of his cruiser, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Arthur," Miller said, touching the brim of his hat. "I'm sorry to do this, buddy, but I'm just enforcing the board's emergency mandate." Arthur's jaw tightened. "What mandate, Jim?" Carmichael stepped forward, holding a soaked, crumpled document. "The Emergency Pathogen and Invasive Species Act of 1998, Huntington. Your fields are a biohazard." "Are you out of your mind, Greg?" David shouted, stepping down from the porch. "Look around you. His fields are the only thing left alive in this entire county." "Exactly," Carmichael spat, his composure cracking. "It's unnatural. We suffered a catastrophic 100-year flood. Every approved regulated crop was decimated. The only way this weed survived is because it altered the subterranean water flow. You disrupted the natural hydrology of the valley, Arthur. You diverted the floodwaters onto my land." It was the most absurd, desperate lie Arthur had ever heard. The sedge wheat hadn't diverted the water. It had simply withstood it while Carmichael's shallow-rooted Aegis 7 dissolved like wet tissue paper. But Carmichael wasn't looking for scientific truth. He was looking for a scapegoat, and more importantly, he was looking for collateral. Arthur's 400 acres of pristine, intact topsoil was now the most valuable piece of real estate in the state. This citation gives the Ag Board full authority to quarantine and eradicate this illegal crop, Carmichael declared, signaling the bulldozer driver. "We are tilling this field under, applying a chemical sterilizer, and seizing the land under eminent domain for the valley's recovery effort." Arthur picked up his shotgun. He didn't point it, but he cracked the action open, the metallic clack echoing sharply across the yard. Sheriff Miller flinched. "Jim," Arthur said, his eyes locked on the sheriff. "Oh, you know as well as I do that Greg is drowning in debt. He's trying to steal my farm to save his own skin. If that bulldozer crosses my property line, I will defend my land. You'll have to arrest me, and you'll have to explain to the state troopers why the Ag Board is tearing up the only surviving topsoil in a disaster zone." Miller held up his hands, turning to Carmichael. "Greg, I'm not initiating a shootout over a civil mandate. Not today. We take this to a judge." Carmichael's face turned a mottled, furious red. "You have exactly 48 hours, Arthur. I will get a federal judge to sign the eradication order. I will burn this field to the bedrock before I let you get away with this." As Carmichael's convoy retreated down the muddy driveway, the adrenaline faded. leaving Arthurin with a cold sense of dread. Carmichael had the lawyers, the money, and the political connections. Arthurin had an overdue banknote and a crop that was technically illegal to sell. The battle wasn't over. It was just moving from the dirt to the courtroom. The clock was ticking. They had 2 days before Carmichael returned with an ironclad court order, and only 3 weeks until Sarah Jenkins at the bank was legally obligated to begin foreclosure proceedings. Arthurin needed a miracle, and he needed it fast. David, fueled by guilt for abandoning his father and a burning anger toward Carmichael, took charge. "We can't fight him locally, Dad. The county judges are all in Carmichael's pocket. We need federal intervention. We need someone who understands exactly what Dr. Cole engineered." David spent the next 24 hours on a satellite phone borrowed from a FEMA rescue coordinator. He called every agricultural university, every soil conservation organization, and every federal botanical institute he could find. Most brushed him off as a panicked farmer exaggerating the situation. Finally, he managed to get through to Dr. Thomas Harris, a lead researcher for the United States Department of Agriculture's Soil Conservation Service in Washington, D.C. Harris had actually been a junior colleague of Dr. Harrison Cole decades ago and knew of the mythical sedge-wheat project, assuming it had been lost to history. When David sent him a photograph of the 400 acres of standing, golden green stalks surrounded by a sea of devastated, muddy bedrock, Dr. Harris boarded a military cargo plane, heading to the disaster zone within the hour. On the morning of the second day, the sedge-wheat did something spectacular. Triggered by the immense stress of the flood and the sudden, blazing summer sun, the plants rapidly matured. The heads of the stalks burst open, revealing thick, heavy clusters of dark amber grain. It was ready to harvest. Arthurin fired up his vintage combine harvester, the engine roaring to life. He wasn't going to let Carmichael bulldoze his legacy. If they were going to destroy the crop, he was going to get the grain out of the fields first. He had only managed to harvest 50 acres when the convoy returned. This time there were no county sheriffs. Carmichael had brought private security contractors, a fleet of 3 massive bulldozers, and a grim-faced state marshal, wielding a thick stack of legal injunctions. "Turn the machine off, Arthurin," Carmichael screamed through a bullhorn, standing safely behind a line of security men. "The federal court of the 6th District has declared your farm a quarantine zone. We are raising the fields." Arthurin idled the combine and climbed down the ladder, his heart pounding against his ribs. David stood by his side, gripping a heavy wrench. The marshals stepped forward, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. "Mr. Huntington, you are in violation of a state agricultural quarantine," the marshal said flatly. "Step aside, or you will be placed under arrest." Arthurin looked at the golden fields, waving in the morning breeze. He had fought the drought, the blight, the flood, and the crushing weight of debt. He was so incredibly tired. Just as the lead bulldozer fired its engine, a black government-issue helicopter descended rapidly from the sky, its rotors kicking up a blinding cloud of dust and silt. It touched down clumsily on Arthurin's front lawn. A tall man in a khaki field jacket stepped out, clutching a metallic briefcase. He ducked under the rotors and jogged directly between the bulldozers and Arthurin's fields. "Shut those engines down," Dr. Thomas Harris bellowed, flashing a laminated Department of Agriculture federal badge at the state marshal. "I am placing this entire 400-acre parcel under the immediate protection of the Federal Emergency Soil Conservation Act." Carmichael stormed forward. "You have no jurisdiction here. This is a state matter. That crop is an illegal invasive biohazard." Dr. Harris turned to Carmichael with a look of absolute disgust. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a sheaf of papers. "Mr. Carmichael, my team has been running satellite telemetry and soil density tests on this valley for the last 24 hours. We know exactly what caused the catastrophic topsoil loss, and it wasn't the rain." Harris turned to face the state marshal and the assembled crowd. For the last decade, Carmichael AgriCorp has mandated the planting of Aegis 7 corn, a genetically modified crop with a root system so aggressively shallow that it systematically destroyed the mycelial networks and structural integrity of the valley's topsoil. When the floodwaters hit, there was absolutely nothing anchoring the earth. Mr. Carmichael, your proprietary seeds turned a natural disaster into an apocalyptic mudslide. Carmichael opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His face drained of all color. Furthermore, Dr. Aris continued, walking over to Arthurin's field and gently touching a stalk of the sedgeweed. This crop didn't just survive the flood. Its root system stabilized the bedrock beneath it, preventing a massive subterranean collapse that would have taken out the county highway system. This isn't a biohazard, Mr. Carmichael. This is the holy grail of sustainable agriculture, and as of this morning, the USDA is officially invalidating your local board's ban on perennial sedge hybrids. The silence in the yard was deafening, save for the rhythmic idling of the combine harvester. Dr. Aris turned to Arthurin, his expression softening. Mr. Huntington, Dr. Cole's notes indicated this plant was theoretical. You proved it was a miracle. The Department of Agriculture wants to buy your entire harvest, every single grain, for seed propagation. We want to distribute this to every flood-prone agricultural zone in the American Midwest. We are prepared to offer you $3 million for the exclusive first-year rights. Arthurin felt his knees go weak. David caught him by the shoulder, laughing out loud, tears streaming down his face. Gregory Carmichael slowly backed away, realizing the devastating reality. With the USDA proving his farming practices caused the structural failure of the valley's soil, his insurance claims would be completely invalidated. He wasn't just bankrupt, he was going to face hundreds of millions of dollars in civil liability suits from the state. His empire was dead. 3 weeks later, Arthurin sat in the polished office of the First Agricultural Union Bank. He slid a certified federal cashier's check across the desk to Sarah Jenkins. Sarah looked at the numbers, her eyes widening. She stamped the Huntington Farms massive debt ledger with a heavy, red ink pad. Paid in full. You really pulled it off, Arthurin, Sarah said, smiling genuinely for the first time in years. What are you going to do now? Arthurin stood up, adjusting his weathered cap. He looked out the bank window toward the distant, rolling hills of his property. The valley would take decades to recover, but his land was alive, breathing, and deeply rooted. I'm going farming, Arthurin smiled. This is a breathtaking story of defying the odds. Arthurin's unwavering belief in the earth and his refusal to bow to corporate greed literally saved his land from being washed off the map. Sometimes the greatest miracles happen deep beneath the surface, where no one is looking. Viewers inspired by Arthurin's incredible resilience and the triumph of the deep-root harvest are encouraged to like the video, share this story with those needing a reminder to stand their ground, and subscribe for more incredible, true-to-life tales.